via Motzei Shabbos.
I
have a couple words of introduction here. Baruch, did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to ask if you were going to be pushing the time. We were talking about just finishing tomorrow, so I was wondering.
Yeah, we're going to have to figure something out in terms of the time, right? Exactly. I don't think it changes drastically between now and Pesach, but I have to double check. Okay. Might be safer to just call it for 7:30 or something like that, but I'm not going to worry about that at this moment. Okay, but that's a possibility. A few words of introduction. The first introduction I guess I'll give, even though Phil stepped away, but he heard it, I said it between Mincha and Ma'ariv, is the first halacha in Hilchos Pesach. Shulchan Aruch, as we perhaps are aware, is divided into 4 sections, and the laws of daily living, Orach Chaim, which include laws of tefillah, the laws of brachos, laws of tefillin, etc. All of those laws, the laws of Shabbos, and some Eruvin, a lot of Eruvin, the laws of the Yomim Tovim, including the laws of Pesach. So all of that is included in Orach Chaim, the laws of daily living. Even though it's not daily, but it's that which we encounter in our daily life throughout the year. Chelik Hey of the Mishnah Berurah, see the Mishnah Berurah, the Chavetz Chaim's commentary on Orach Chaim is a Mishnah Berurah. We don't have Mishnah Berurah on the other sections of Shulchan Aruch. Different people wrote similar, including Rav Chaim Kanievsky, by the way. He wrote a Mishnah Berurah on other parts of Zeroim and different aspects of halacha that we do not have a Mishnah Berurah on. However, what I'm trying to get to, I apologize, I'm a little bit tired, is Chelik Hey of the Mishnah Berurah, which is the 6 volumes of Orach Chaim. Chelik Hey discusses the laws of Pesach. And the first halacha of Hilchos Pesach, which is Siman Tuf Chaf Tes, which is 429. I mentioned that Joel just heard this between Mincha and Ma'ariv, so he'll bear with it. So actually, the name of the siman is that we don't say Tachanun during the month of Nisan. But so before you get to the month of Nisan, though, is halacha number Aleph, which is Shoalim B'Hilchos Pesach Kodem LaPesach Shloshim Yom, which is that we ask about the laws of Pesach for 30 days prior to the holiday of Pesach. And the Bir Halacha quotes the Torah, it says Shoalim V'Dorshin is actually the language of the Gemara in a number of places, which is not only do we ask questions, but we're actually darshan, that is, people have a responsibility to teach the laws and ideas of Pesach already 30 days before leading up to Pesach. The reason brought down by the Beis Yosef is because there's many aspects to Pesach. There's so many aspects of different kinds of halachos that are relevant for Pesach, and you can't wait until Pesach itself. It'll be too late. It'll be too late. Things will already be chametz, or you won't have proper matzah, or you won't be able to kasher your kelim anymore. Other challenges that are there. Now, where do we learn this from? This idea of starting 30 days before is actually from Moshe Rabbeinu himself, who taught the laws of Pesach Sheni on Pesach Rishon. There were certain people that were not eligible because they were tamei, that encountered dead body, and therefore they were not eligible for eating the carbon Pesach the first time around, so they got to eat it a month later on the 15th of Iyar. So this is concept number 1. Concept number 1 is that we definitely want to start Pesach early. We don't want to wait till it's too late. What really happens when we wait till 2 weeks before is we only really get a week of Shiurim in, because Erev Pesach I'm just too busy. So I think it definitely makes sense and it's appropriate to begin Pesach already now. The Reb Shlomo Zalman brings down that for people who learn halacha every day, they should switch to the laws of Pesach at this point in time and begin reviewing the laws of Pesach, and that would be an appropriate thing to do, even if though they're learning some other aspect, some other area of halacha. By the last introduction for tonight is that the idea that Mishnechnas Adar Marbin B'Simcha. The Mishnah tells us in Tainus that when the month of Adar begins, so we increase the amount of happiness that we have. And why is that? First of all, Rashi says it's not just the month of Adar, it's Adar and Nisan. 2 months. For this year, 3 months. So Adar and Nisan. So Mishnachnas Adar Marben B'Simcha. It's because they're all months of Geula, months of redemption. We certainly hope that we are headed towards that. The Gemara Megillah talks about Mashiach coming during Shemitah, or right after Shemitah, and that, of course, we are holding in Shemitah now. I want to mention, yeah. So Joel's suggesting that Adar is the last month of the biblical year, and Nisan is the first month of the biblical year, meaning because the Jews got out of Mitzrayim in the month of Nisan, therefore the Torah refers to it as Chodesh HaRishon, and therefore it's a happy time because it's kind of a rollover on the year. Could be. Rashi says that there is Mani Geula, there are times of redemption for Klal Yisrael, historically and therefore presently, and therefore it's time of Simcha. I do want to talk about Geula in depth tonight, or at least begin the discussion about freedom. Nothing to do with freedom from and freedom to. I shouldn't say nothing to do with it, but that's not the focus. That has been the focus in years past. I want to mention that I was amazed today. Reb Chaim Kanievsky, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, as I'm sure you heard, was nifter on Friday afternoon at about 3:30 in the afternoon. We heard about it right after Shacharis on Friday morning. I heard about it on my way home, around 8 o'clock in the morning. So about 3:30 in the Friday afternoon, he had a heart attack, and they were not, unfortunately, sadly, unable to revive him. He died. He was 94 years old. And a couple stories that I heard today, or that I heard from the funeral, was at very early this morning. One of the stories that I heard was that I guess after his wife had passed away, or somebody had passed away, and he gave a shir in her memory on Yerushalmi on Matzah Shabbos, a Saturday night shir. And then once the time of mourning had passed, he stopped giving the shir. So they asked him, "Why'd you stop giving the shir?" He said he doesn't have time. They said, "What's the difference? You're learning this, you're learning that." He says, "No, it wasn't giving the shir wasn't the problem. The problem was I didn't have time to prepare." So they asked him, "Well, how long did it take you to prepare the shir?" He said, 5 minutes. He didn't have the 5 minutes to spare. Okay? That's on the one hand. On the other hand, he used to spend 35, 40 minutes a day responding to letters that he received in the mail. Questions from all over the globe, usually of halachic nature. And he did so because he felt that people wanted a connection to him, and he was doing a chesed. And of course, he also spent hours every single day receiving people and giving them brachas and listening to their problems. And there was 200-300 people in a receiving line daily. And he spent a few moments with each one. So it wasn't like he was miserly with his time, but he just utilized his time. They shared today just to give you a sense of it, you never even heard of most of these things probably, if I had to guess. And that's in no way a condescending statement. I haven't heard of some of them as well, despite all my years of learning. So they published his Seder Hayom. So what would he do every single day? How would he spend his day? Okay. Trying to find the right chat where it was here. Oh, here we go. Okay. Every day he learned. So he would wake up half an hour after Chatzos and say Tikkun Chatzos at night, so 1 o'clock in the morning. Then he would learn 11 pages of Zohar, 10 prakim of Tehillim, 8 chapters of Tanakh, 10 simanim of Mishnah Berurah, 8 prakim of Rambam, 10 simanim of Torah Shulchan Aruch, 8 daf of Talmud Bavli, 8 daf of Talmud Yerushalmi, 8 prakim of Midrashim, 8 pages of Kisvei Hari, 8 pages of Kisvei Ramchal. Then he would write his chidushim. Then he would write his novel thoughts. Twice a day for an hour, people would come for a bracha. During that time, he would also continue to learn. Every year, he made a siyam on all of Zohar, Tanakh, Mishnah Berurah, Rambam, Torah, Shulchan Aruch, Bavli, Tosefta, Yerushalmi, Midrashim, Kisvei Hari, Kisvei Ramchal. The siyam always took place on Erev Pesach, the 14th of Nisan, for Tainus Bechorim. Okay? This year was a leap year, so he did the siyam on the 14th of Adar, the day before he passed away. That's unbelievable. That's unreal. So this is a very unique person. I don't know there's ever been anybody like him in terms of sheer amount of learning that he would do every single day. He also wrote many svarim, some of which I have. I once heard that he wrote it that during every leap year he would write a sefer because he had an extra month of time. But I think he wrote even more than that. Yeah, no. All right, so our learning should be. I mean, I find it kind of almost comedic to say, "Oh, our learning should be in his merit. He needs our merit." Yeah, he's probably doing okay. Nonetheless, our learning should make up. I heard today. I heard yesterday on Shabbos. People ask, especially in the yeshiva world, people say, "Oh, so Reb Chaim died. So who's the next Gadol Hadar?" So Rabbi Langer was saying that's a question that's a person who's curious about the news. That's not the right question to ask. That's like hawking. That's like I just want information. But the right question to ask is how can we make up for the lack of Torah learning that he did? I do want to mention something, and I don't know, it might be a little bit strange. There's just a couple small things, and this is really unrelated to this year, but I don't know, it's just on my mind. I'm reading a biography about Rabbi Yitzchak Shiner. Rabbi Yitzchak Shiner grew up in Pittsburgh. He had a math scholarship. He went to public high school. He had a math scholarship to go to University of Pittsburgh or something like that. And Rabbi Bender's father, famous Rabbi Bender in New York, his father was a person who used to collect money, I guess, for Torah Vodaas or some yeshiva in New York. And he met this young man and he said to him, why don't you come to yeshiva instead of going to college? And his parents were shocked. His parents they loved the idea of him going to yeshiva, but they didn't even know there were yeshivas in America. They were in Pittsburgh. There were no yeshivas in Pittsburgh. It wasn't like today. They were not connected to the community in New York at all. And they sent their son to yeshiva. Initially, he went to YU, and then he went to Torah Vodaas, where he met Reb Shlomo Hyman. Shlomo Hyman was his Rebbe. Reb Shlomo Hyman was also my Rebbe, Rav Kalevsky's Rebbe. Reb Shlomo Hyman was apparently that Reb Baruch Ber found him on a street in some town in Europe, a kid who was just running wild. And he met up with these kids and he asked them a bunch of riddles. And Reb Shlomo Hyman, as a young kid, was obviously very bright. He was able to answer the riddles. He says, "Who's your family? What are you doing? What are you doing with your time?" And he said, and basically he brought this little boy named Shlomo, he brought him to yeshiva. Ultimately, Reb Shlomo Hyman became a Rosh Yeshiva and from the greatest sages of his time. And when Reb Shlomo Hyman died, Rabbi Shiner was there at the time. He wasn't in the room itself, but he was in the anteroom. And Reb Shlomo was dying, but he was on his deathbed. But he asked for two chairs to be brought for the two guests. And they asked him, "Who are the two guests?" Because they didn't see anybody. He says, "Reb Akiva Eger and Reb Chaim Ozer." He says, "They've come to spend time with me." And obviously, he was transitioning already to the next world, and he saw them, and so that's why he asked for the two chairs that his guests should have a place. You think like who's greeting Reb Chaim Kanievsky? It's just unbelievable to think about who this man was. We can't begin to imagine. My father, Olav Hashem, would say he doesn't come to the toenails of Rabbi Krauss, a local Talmud Chacham. Rabbi Krauss doesn't come to the toenails of Rabbi Kanievsky. We can't begin to imagine, who this man was. But that's one thing that I wanted to mention. I guess it's on my mind. And obviously today he was buried today. I don't know how many, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people descended on Bnei Brak. I spoke to a couple of cousins who attended. They said that all the highways were shut down. They're only allowing buses through. And it was besides for the craziness by the grave itself, otherwise it was peaceful and inspiring, and it was a very important day, a very, very important day. I went to Rav Shach's Levaya. When Rav Shach passed away in 2001, I went to his funeral. There was only 400,000 people there. But when Rav Yosef died, there were 850,000 people there. These numbers, we can't even begin to imagine what these numbers look like. But that was today, and obviously it's on my mind. I wanted to share it with you. But what Rabbi Langer said is that what the right question for us to ask is, what can we do to make up for that loss of learning in the world? Second thing I wanted to mention for Rabbi Shiner, and this might come across as a little bit strange. It's actually quite disturbing, Rafal. I don't know if you can handle it, but Reb Baruch Ber Leibowitz, also one of the premier Rosh Yeshiva in Europe. He was in Baranovich. I think he was in Baranovich. I forget exactly where he was, but Reb Baruch Ber Leibowitz was again. He was in the 1910s, 20s, 30s. He was one of the Gedolei Ador, also immersed in learning. His amelus in learning, the intensity of his effort, his toil in learning was second to none. And he died, I believe, in 1938. I think it was 1938. And when the Chazon Ish heard about it, and Rav Scheiner was there, or he heard from the person who was there in the room, Chazon Ish started to, he became extremely agitated. I'm not going to say the story exactly the way he says it, but he became extremely agitated and he started screaming and crying. And he said the reason why he's so upset is because the only thing that held Hitler back from taking over Europe was their Baruch Ber's amelus in Torah. Wow. That's what he said. Now, who am I to even understand such a thing? So that's on the one hand. So here we have Reb Chaim Kanievsky and his amelus in Torah, and I imagine the past few weeks he hasn't been as well. I imagine he hasn't been up doing exactly what he used to do. I don't know. Again, we said he made a siyum the day before he died. On the one hand, we hope that, on the one hand, that's obviously a possibility. You look around the world, you look at Putin, you look what's going on in the world. It's a very uncomfortable timing. On the other hand, when a tzaddik dies, when a righteous person dies, it's Megan. It brings protection for Klal Yisrael. And that protection is something that we know that from the Gemara, and Rashi tells us in Chumash that just as the Parah Aduma is mechaper, just as the red heifer atones for Klal Yisrael, so too the death of tzaddikim atones for Klal Yisrael as well, and so obviously we hope that is the case here with Reb Chaim Kanievsky being taken from us. That's all by way of introduction. Just some thoughts are on my mind relating to his patira. Yes, thank you very much. Reb Baruch Ber was in Slobodkin Kamenetz, famous for being in Kamenetz, I believe, being the Rosh Yeshiva of Kamenetz. I have a number of questions that I want to ask about Pesach. We're not going to get to all the answers tonight. So we have, Barry's familiar with this phenomenon. It's called don't learn. Barry, who's your favorite Pirush? The Abarbanel, correct? We can see Abarbanel. I can't see you so far from your camera there. Don't try to unmute, Barry. You have a challenge with that. But I think it's the Abarbanel. So if people say, don't learn the Abarbanel when you're tired. Why? You'll end up a kofar. You'll end up how do you say it in English? Somebody who denies the divinity of Torah. Apostate. Something like that. Thank you, apostate. Why? Because you're going to read all the questions, you're going to fall asleep, you're not going to get to any of the answers. So you shouldn't study the Abarbanel when you're tired. Tonight's questions are not going to make anybody into a kofar, even if we don't get to the answers. But it will leave us very confused about Pesach, so you'll have to come back for the second shiur. Okay? And maybe even the third shiur. The essay that I want to share with you tonight is from a sefer called Hadeya v'Hadibur. The sefer is very precious to me and close to my heart, and I'm so happy that I decided to teach one of his essays, his speeches. I'm not sure exactly. It's a drush for you this year. It's written by Reb Zalman Sorotzkin. Reb Zalman Sorotzkin originally from Telz, from Europe. Then he became a rabbi in Yerushalayim. And this sefer was printed in 1990 when I was 10 years old. Reb Zalman Sorotzkin wrote a chumash called Aznayim LeTorah. We have it here in the shul in English. I have it at home in Hebrew. It's one of my favorite chumashim. And he many times references, he says an idea, like very briefly, and then he says, V'ayin mashakasafti beha dalid vav dalid. And I always wondered what that was. And then I discovered he meant Hadeya v'Hadibur. I said, okay, let me go buy the sefer, Hadeya v'Hadibur. And I couldn't find it anywhere. And I went to Eretz Yisrael twice. I couldn't find it anywhere. There's a long story that I've shared with you before about how I got the sefer. It has to do with divine providence and how Hashem took me off the highway. I picked up a hitchhiker who was his great-great-grandson. And I asked him where I could find it. And he called his grandfather who said, yeah, it's not in print, but I have one more set. And I bought a copy from him. And I brought it back. And I have it here. And this is the sefer that I'm sharing with you tonight is Hadeya v'Hadibur. So his style is he likes to begin with a couple, one or two or more Mamorei Chazal, teachings of our sages, and then he asks questions, and then he gives you an approach, and he shows you how he answers it. Now, the historical timing of this essay doesn't say here what year he gave this speech or wrote the essay, but he lived through the war, and you will see clearly that he was very impacted by the war, and he makes references to different aspects of the war and post-war and the way that the Jewish people were dealt with in this essay. But let's begin with the Mamorei Chazal, with the teachings of our sages. The Torah tells us in chapter 13 of Exodus, Shemos Yud Gimel, Hayom atem yotzim b'chodesh aviv. Today you are going to leave, you're going to exit, you're going to flee in the spring month, b'chodesh ha'aviv, in the month of Nisan. Like Joel mentioned earlier, it's the first month of the Torah because that's when the Jews left Egypt. So it's the beginning of the Torah, so to say, of their Torah. And therefore, it says the Pasuk, it's going to be spring. Why does the Torah say it's Chodesh Ha'aviv? Why does the Torah tell us that it was a month of spring? Why is that important? It says the Mechilta in chapter 16, which is a halachic medrash on the second book of the Torah, the book of Shemos. Chodeshu kosher. It's a kosher month. And what makes the month kosher? Lo chama kosher. It's not intensely hot. Velo geshamim, nor is it a rainy month. So that's the first teaching. Chodesh Aviv, the Jews got out specifically in a month that was a pleasant month. Then we have another pasuk. This pasuk is in the 16th chapter of Devarim, Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Torah. Here too, the Torah refers to the month of Nisan as Chodesh Aviv. Torah says, Shemor es Chodesh Aviv. Protect, watch, guard the spring month. V'asisa Pesach LaHashem Elokecha. You shall do a Korban Pesach for Hashem your God. Offer the sacrifice that's specific to the holiday of Pesach for Hashem. Ki b'chodesh ha'aviv, because it was in the spring month, Hotziyacha Hashem Elokecha miMitzrayim, that God took you out of Egypt. Laila, nighttime. You kind of have to see the pasuk really to fully appreciate it. But the Sifri says, why does it stress again? Chodesh Ha'aviv says it twice here in the pasuk. One, protect the Chodesh, which is spring, the month which is spring. Number two, for God took you out during the month which was spring from Egypt at night. So it says the Sifri, which is again a halachic medrash on the book of Devarim, Chodesh Shehu Kosher. Same idea. It's a month which is kosher. Lo cham, it's not hot. V'lo tzonein, and it's not freezing cold, and it's not cold. So these are the two teachings of Chazal, and these are what we're going to focus on. What is this idea that Pesach has to happen during the spring? So we have a series of questions. Maybe somebody wants to take notes and make sure that we get back to all the questions. Okay? Question number one. If the whole purpose of the Jewish people is that they're leaving Egypt in a month which is not too hot and it's not rainy, so why do they not go out in the month of Tishrei? Tishrei is also not a particularly hot month, not a particularly rainy month, at least in Egypt and Israel. For us, it could still be pretty hot here in Southern California. In fact, the Gemara in Shabbos says that the days of Nisan and the days of Tishrei have a very similar climate. By the way, this is a Talmud Chacham. You know where a Talmud Chacham brings a proof to the idea that climate is one way or another? Not by going outside, not by checking his iPhone for the weather, but by quoting a Gemara. The Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Mem Gimel, page 43, tells us that the days of Tishrei and the days of Nisan have a very similar climate. So that's kind of question number one. Okay, so I understand you want it to be a nice month. Why does it have to be in the spring? Question number two. Very nice, he says. The Jewish people got out of Egypt in the spring, and wasn't it pleasant? Wasn't it pleasant? And then they were stuck in the desert for 40 years, where they were protected, but theoretically, you had those horrible seasons. Who cares if, the few days leading up to those 40 years were nice days or not? Now, the truth is that they were protected from the elements mostly by the clouds of glory. So maybe that's not such a strong question. But the idea being that without having to come to rely on miracles, simply understanding the nature of the Exodus, they're going to be wandering for quite a while. And even if they end up going straight to Israel, they still have to go through the heat. So let them have a few more days of heat. Like, what's the difference? Who cares? Why is this such a big deal that they went out in a month which was a pleasant month? So maybe you'll argue oh. So there's value to a good start, a pleasant beginning. Is that all there is to it? I mean, he says that the Torah in two places, we already read two psukim, one in the 13th chapter of Shemos, one in the 16th chapter of Devarim, and then you have the same thing in Tehillim as well, where Chazal said the same idea, that the pasuk says, Motzi Asirim B'Kashrus, which means God took out those who were bound up at a time that was kosher. And the Mechilta says the same thing, like why Chazal are going out of their way to make a big deal out of the pasuk, and the pasuk seems to be going out of its way to make a big deal about this spring month. So what is the big deal? It can't simply be, the few days at the beginning of the journey were pleasant. To add to the question, we have the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah that we're all familiar with, especially this year. I've mentioned it in Shul a couple of times, that the Torah says we should make sure that Pesach falls out during the spring. What is this a warning? To whom is this a warning? Or to whom is this a direction? To Beis Din. To Beis Din, to the Jewish court. To be Me'aber Hashana, B'shas HaTzorech. To go ahead and make sure that there is a leap year when it's necessary, in order to make it so that the lunar months line up with the solar months. So, winter and summer, of course, depend on the solar calendar. And we always want Pesach to come out during the spring. That's what the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says on Daf Chaf Aleph. Right? We're familiar with this idea that the solar year is 365 days, the lunar year is 354 days. 365 minus 354 is 11. So that means after 3 years, they're going to be a full month apart. Even if, let's say, next year, well, let's make it easy. Pesach would have fallen out in March, the beginning of March. It's too soon. It needs to fall out in April. It needs to fall out in the spring. Is today the first day of spring? Right. So it needs to fall out in spring. And if it would have fallen out already, if it would have fallen out a month ago, I wouldn't have fallen a month ago, it would have fallen out right now. But I guess it has to be further into the spring, I guess. Or even next year, they would have been a real issue, right? Next year would have fallen out even earlier. So I guess they want to have now the way we have the leap year now is to even head it off. So the idea is that the lunar year and the solar year have to match up. So we have the extra month. I pointed out that there's another religion that celebrates a holiday called Ramadan. And those poor people who have to fast for a whole month. And what happens when that falls out during the summer months? So if they're really frum and they're not eating or drinking anything the whole day, I don't know if they drink water or not. I have no idea. Not really important for right now. But the Torah goes to such an extent to keep Pesach during the spring. Like, why? What is the big deal? The next question, in some ways, I think is the strongest, most disturbing sort of question. And I gotta mention to you that this is a rabbi, this is a man who survived the Holocaust. I don't remember exactly when he got to Israel. I don't know if there is a biography of Reb Zalman Sorotzkin. I think there is. I don't know exactly. Let's see. He was born in 1881. He died in 1966. And according to Wikipedia,
How do you spell it?
Sorotzkin, Sorotzkin. OT. Bum bum. Okay. In 1914, he moved to Minsk, where he became a friend of the Chazon Ish. In 1930, he was a rabbi in Lutsk until World War II. He managed to flee from the war, escape to the, it says here, Mandate Palestine. I assume they mean Israel. Okay, so basically he fled. I don't know, it doesn't say the whole story here, but he fled from the war and he managed to get to Eretz Yisrael. Okay. This question about that I'm about to ask, I think in a way is the strongest question. This is a question that the wandering Jew, the suffering Jew, could appreciate. What is Pesach? Everyone knows. When we daven, we say Chag Hamatzos Zman Cherutenu. It's the holiday of matzah, a time of cherus, a time of freedom. So he says, if we were actually living in a time of freedom, how wonderful it would be. And we would celebrate because they were slaves and now they're free. But what is the Jewish history? His expression in Hebrew, he says, is Sha'parot b'divrei yamav meruba la'omed. He's borrowing from the language of a Gemara in Eruvin, which he says that if you count up Jewish history, how many years of Jewish history are there? Anybody know? What year was the Torah given in? I believe it was 2448. And now we are in 5782 minus 2448. There's 3,334 years of Jewish history. How many years? We could do the math here. Anybody know Jewish history well enough? How many years were the Jews in the land of Israel prior to the first Beis HaMikdash? I believe it's around 400. My numbers are very rough, okay? How many years was the second Beis HaMikdash? The first Beis HaMikdash? Around 400. How many years was the second temple? Around 400. So that leaves us with 2,134. So for at least 2/3 of our history, we have been in exile. Right? Think about it. For at least 2/3 of our history, we have been in exile. And even the second Beis HaMikdash, second temple era was not quite redemption. I mean, maybe the beginning of it, but even then, we built it with the permission of Darius and etc. Not exactly what I would call, utopia. So he says, how could we celebrate Pesach as a time of freedom? Most of our history has been with avdus and shiflus. Avdus is slavery, shiflus is a certain lowliness. Did I get it right? You said 2448. Is that what I said, Rafal? I think that's what I said. Okay. Jerry's pointing out that there's a link between spring and the Shalosh Regalim. Yeah, there's a whole approach to the Yom Tovim being agricultural, no question. But this last question, though, to me, literally blows my mind. Okay, and now he's going to, in his next paragraph, he strengthens the question. He stresses the question. In this generation, he's a Jew who survived the war. He says many similar generations. Imagine you're a Ukrainian Jew. You're going to sit down to the Pesach Seder in some random place in Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, in some random place, and you're going to say it's a time of freedom. You just left. You just got exiled from your house, from your home, all your worldly goods, from your job. He says, Halo tov hayalanu avodas Mitzrayim. It would have been better from a physical perspective for us to still be in Egypt. His language is, better for us to be slaves in Egypt than to die in the cultured Europe. In Mitzrayim, in Egypt, we were slaves. But here in this generation, he says, we were sold off to be killed and destroyed. God forbid, to be decimated, a genocide. He says millions of our brothers and sisters were destroyed, suffered in the camps. They certainly were jealous of their forefathers in Egypt. Yeah, they were slaves in Egypt, but there was some sort of seichel to it. There was some sort of understanding. Right? They tried not to exhaust them. They didn't kill them. They had one day off a week. They had Shabbos off. They had pity on them. Same way you'd have pity on your animal. You wouldn't want to overwork your animal, so they had pity on their slaves. They made their work better. But the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, he says, the Nazis, they just went about trying to destroy the Jewish people. That was their whole goal. He says, Al Pirov, in most cases, it was just to cause them terrible suffering and a dearthening, if there's such a word, maybe I made that up, of strength. Milk them to the last drop of their blood. And then once they were done with, they just destroyed them. They just killed them in a cruel way. Yeah, the Mitzrayim, of course, they did terrible things. What did they do? They shechted Jewish children. They slaughtered Jewish children. Or they threw Jewish children into the Nile River. Why? They had a reason to do it. The king had saras, had spiritual leprosy, told him he had to bathe in Jewish blood. Okay, of course, it didn't help him, but he thought he was doing it for a reason. They found out that the Mashiach, the savior of the Jews, was going to be born, and in the end is going to be punished through water, which of course he was at the Meriva when he hit the stone and started talking to it. And so therefore they took all the boys and they threw them into the water. Which is the Nazis, just straight cruelty, no cheshbonos, no rhyme, no reason for anything that they did. He said they had an expression, the kinder action. And of course their whole purpose was to destroy the future of Klal Yisrael. Remember last week's shir about the Matanas Avyonim, the Mishlach Manos, where he held up the child, and he said that's the future. The Nazis tried doing the exact opposite. He says that the Nazis killed 10 times the amount of people that left Egypt, right? 6 million to 600,000. He says all the Jews in Western Europe, from young to old, men, women, and children. He said we have some survivors who miraculously survived. But he says, nevertheless, they have tremendous difficulties. Right? And we know that even when they survived, they went back home, they had nothing, they were kicked out of their homes, that people were not welcoming to them. We know that people, and then he goes on further. Ha'amim haneurim, even the ones who were good, like the Americans, the British, the ones who fought against Hitler. They weren't interested in taking in survivors. They were not interested in giving them a place of refuge. And they even closed off Eretz Yisrael, which the United Nations, of course, had agreed after the war should become a base leumi, a national home for the Jewish people. So this question that he's asking, and again, he's speaking from such a painful place, is how could Pesach be a time of freedom? Chodesh, who cares? Chodesh Av back then, it was in the spring. so much pain. Right? And yet we know, B'chol dar v'dar, chayiv adam liros atzmo, kilu hu yatzam mitzrayim, the Gemara in Pesachim on page 116, that every generation a person has to imagine they themselves have left Egypt. And he says, a person who eats chametz, and then he says, even in the death camps, unless of course he had to eat chametz to stay alive, obviously that was a mitzvah. But if not, if he did it just because he was in the mood to eat it, it's a chiyuv kares. Obviously, there's the mitzvah of matzah, not eating chametz, destroying all the chametz, making sure we eat only matzah. The mitzvah to tell over the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim on the night of the redemption. That it is man chayreseinu, it is the time of our freedom. Obviously, that's what it is, but it's so hard to understand. It's so hard to understand. Nevertheless, we know that we daven Ma'ariv tonight. What do we say? Hamakeh be'evreso kol b'chori Mitzrayim. The Anshe Knesset Hagdol, the men of the Great Assembly, the ones who wrote the blessings of the Kriya Shema, who wrote the Sidur. What do we say? Hamakeh be'evreso kol b'chori Mitzrayim. God punished all the firstborn in Egypt. Vayotze es amo Yisrael mitocham. And he took the Jewish people out, l'cheirus olam, to a freedom that was forever. That's omedes l'olam vayed. It's a freedom that's forever. So he says, no matter what we're experiencing, there's an aspect of cheirus, an aspect of freedom that we attained, that we got when the Jews left Egypt, and that's still in existence. And nothing can take that away from us. I think we'll leave it there for tonight. And like I said, we haven't really answered our questions yet, which is why you have to come back for part 2. But this last question is a very powerful question. And it's a question that means more to us. I'm not going to say it means more to us than it did to them, but it's a question that has relevance for us. Certainly people who have struggled in their own personal lives and don't see cheirus, don't see freedom. But in the coming weeks, Emir Hashem will continue, and we'll learn more about how his approach to Pesach being in the spring, a time good for the Jewish people, and what it means to be free even when we're not really free. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you for listening. Anybody have any questions? I have a couple of minutes, like 1 or 2, before I have to run to Night Seder at Kollel, but happy for you to chime in.
Rabbi, sometime you'll do some of the